Hey everybody, welcome to History Quest. I'm your host, Brian Haynes, the Executive Director of the McLeod County Historical Society here in Hutchinson, Minnesota. As always, I've got some stories to share for you, as well as some events that are coming up at the museum in the month of June. The year was 1831. Near Montreal, Canada, at a place called Hoag's Hollow, a male child was born. His name was John H. Mackenzie. For years, Quebec, or Lower Canada as it was called, was at odds with their colonial ruler, the British Crown. In 1837 and 1838, Lower Canadian separatists staged a pair of insurrections against the Crown. The armed conflict, which became known as the Patriots' War, was bloody and claimed around 300 lives. Young John Mackenzie's father was part of this insurrection, and in 1841 fled to the United States with his family. The Mackenzie family moved to Illinois and began farming. At the age of 15, for whatever the reason, John ran away from home to begin life on his own. In 1850, he found himself on the way to Minnesota. Minnesota was still a very new territory in 1850, having just been given the status of territory a year prior. John's trek to the state was with a party of pioneers who were heading overland through Wisconsin. Among the party was a man named John Stevens, who would become a well-known fixture in the early days of McLeod County. The party located in Minnesota, yet Mackenzie was looking for something more and headed north to Itasca, where he entered the trade business with the Indians. Things didn't exactly work out for John. In 1855, he lost all of his possessions, including 1,214 town lots in Minnesota. Down on his luck, Mackenzie moved south back to Illinois and married a young woman named Mary Trumbull. The couple didn't linger long, however, and in the fall of that year found themselves traveling north to Minnesota, where John would again try to make it. They settled in Hutchinson, where John recorded his experience. He writes, "About the middle of June, 1856, I took 2 yokes of oxen, a wagon, my 2 brothers, and drove to Hutchinson and camped. Several log cabins then constituted the village. We went out east of town, made a claim, and prepared hay for the winter. I moved into a house that stood on the north side of the river. It was built out of popple logs, contained 2 rooms, and was shingled with clapboards. The following winter, my family occupied one end of the house, while the other was occupied by Timothy and Solomon Pendergast. Solomon trapped wolves within sight of our house that winter." At that time, the country was celebrated for its great quantities of wild game. Fur-bearing game consisted of otter, mink, muskrat, sable, fox, wolf, and fisher. Around the lakes were well-beaten paths made by deer and moose. And around these same lakes were ducks, geese, brants, and swans. In the spring of 1857, the boys in Hutchinson built a fish dam across the river and caught great quantities of large fish. Some of the buffalo fish weighed over 100 pounds. Most of the new settlers in McLeod County were of limited means, and many were the hardships that we were called upon to endure. But as there is more to be enjoyed in pursuing an object than there is in possessing it, everybody winked at the hardships and looked forward to the glorious future of McLeod County. Mackenzie didn't stay in McLeod County for long, and in 1861 moved to the Red River Valley. When the war with the Dakota broke out in 1862, he became a scout. The following year, he gained fame for apprehending 2 prominent Dakota leaders from the uprising, Medicine Bottle and Little Six, and he then brought them across the Canadian border into the United States. There's no doubt that John Mackenzie lived a fascinating life filled with adventure and the struggles presented on the frontier. Though his time in McLeod County was short, his foresight to record his experiences offer a rare glimpse into the early years of the area. Mackenzie's full manuscript includes much more, yet as only part of it refers to this region, the remaining is beyond the scope of this story. One thing that is for certain, however, when it comes to the storied history of the man, McLeod County can pridefully say that he was once one of our own. So that was the story of John Mackenzie. I recently wrote another piece about him where he offers kind of another look into McLeod County history. Very interesting. This would have been in 1859, and these two gentlemen come into town, and they're looking to buy land in town. And they're not your typical pioneers. In this letter that Mackenzie wrote, he writes of the people that are living in Hutchinson at the time. They're all congregated at the Merrill House, or the Harrington Merrill House, and at this time the house isn't even finished. It's just basically a shell, and so they're all just kind of hanging out around this house, and then these two guys come across the river, presumably from St. Paul. They're dressed in like suits, and one of them is wearing kid gloves, and they're trying to find land in the area, and the settlers in Hutchinson are kind of like, well, no way, we don't, you're not going to fit in here, basically, is what they're saying. And eventually they relent and they say, well, if you're going to move here, we'll do our best to make you feel welcome and everything. On kind of a humorous note, Mackenzie looks at the one in kid gloves and says something along the lines of, well, we don't fully trust people who wear mittens in summertime, though. At any rate, he's talking about the settlers living here, and they're all wearing threadbare clothes. Most of them are barefoot. They've all got holes in their pants, holes in their shirts, missing buttons and everything, wearing moccasins. And, this is all from toiling out on the frontier for over a year. But at any rate, this story that I just read, and then Mackenzie's other stories on McLeod County and Hutchinson, offer just kind of a rare glimpse into what life was like at that time. You use your imagination, and you can about imagine it. Very few roads, kind of a wild landscape, wild animals. You still had Native Americans, I don't want to say wandering, but coming through the area to trade and to hunt and everything. So very much a different time, different atmosphere than what we have right now. That atmosphere, that kind of wild atmosphere, really didn't end until the 1890s. Into the early 1900s, where the railroad has come through McLeod County, roads have been built, land has been sectioned off. There's still kind of quote unquote wild country around, but it's nothing like that frontier style wild country that there was back in the 1850s. When you do move into the 1890s, however, it's kind of an interesting period because you're at this transition zone where you have this old way of life where people are riding horses. There's no electricity, no plumbing, no such thing as a paved street. And people had largely been living that way for 1,000 years or more. And at this time, end of the 1800s, moving into the 1900s, all of a sudden you're moving into this more modern area where there are, railroad depots everywhere, trains, roads everywhere. You can easily get goods that you need from out east, whereas prior you couldn't. Not only that, but, steam engines are prevalent. There's, soon to be electricity, soon to be automobiles. And so it's kind of this interesting period in time, almost like the quote-unquote Old West meets the New Age. And actually, this next story takes place at this time where there's a murder down in Buffalo Creek. Now, I believe I've actually told this story before, and I wrote it quite a while ago, but I wanted to revisit it. It's one of my favorite stories, and it fits well with kind of this theme we're at right now. It's called Murder at Buffalo Creek. It was spring, a time of rejuvenation. It was May of 1897. Winter had passed and the thaw was all but over, leading people to look forward to the summer ahead. Yet, as the trees were beginning to fully leaf out, the grass was beginning to grow up and grow tall, and the smell of the thawed-out earth rose to the air, some remnants of winter were still left about the land. One such place was north of Brownton, on a bridge that traversed Buffalo Creek. The winter ice was treacherous that year, pushing, pulling, and twisting the bridge and contorting it into an impassable mess. This, of course, became something of a spectacle for people in the area. On the morning of May 11th, two school children did just that as they passed the warped bridge on their way to school. As children do, they playfully walked around the banks of the river, likely throwing stones into the water, kicking up dead leaves off the ground, and making merry as they went on their way to school. Their playful glee was soon interrupted, however, as they laid their eyes on something that no child should see. Laying face down in the shallow water along the banks of Buffalo Creek was the body of a man. The children screamed, ran as fast as they could to the school, and alerted their teacher, Miss Sarah McAdams. Miss McAdams ran to the scene, followed closely by her school children. When they reached the body, however, the teacher fainted, leaving the children huddled in fear. A few of the kids ran to a nearby farmhouse for help. Sue and a group of locals formed a party and ran to the scene. The men waded into the river and pulled the dead body from the water. While doing so, they made a ghastly discovery. His throat had been slit from ear to ear. As a result of the discovery, a small ad hoc jury was assembled to address the situation and decipher what happened to the man. After a bit of investigating, they believed to have identified the man as John Bowen and ruled that he had committed suicide by means of cutting his own throat. For all purposes, the case was considered closed, or so they thought. Years later, a man lay on his deathbed in a Minneapolis hospital. The man's name is unknown today, but he confessed to something that had been eating at his conscience for years. Apparently, in May of 1897, this unnamed man had encountered John Bowen near Brownton, where he learned that Bowen was carrying a large sum of money. He told Bowen that he was a barber and that Bowen needed a shave. Bowen sat down on the banks of the river, thinking he was about to get that shave. Instead, the unnamed man, standing behind Bowen, slit his throat and made away with the money. With Bowen's money in hand, this unnamed murderer conducted some business in a nearby town and remained undetected, living in McLeod County for some time after. 6 years later, however, while lying on his deathbed, he would recount the murder at Buffalo Creek. So that was the story of the murder at Buffalo Creek. Like I said, you may recognize that story as I've done it before, but it's a great example of how, how I was talking earlier about how the 1800s meet the 1900s, and there's kind of this, just little clash of eras. And of course, in McLeod County, this is right around the same time that, Sheriff Rogers is murdered by the two drifters coming through. And it's just kind of like I said, just an interesting little period. Especially in the sense that, like, this guy gets away with it. I think we like to think today, we can catch our murderers. And maybe that's not completely truth. We don't always get the bad guys, or I should say our law enforcement doesn't always get the bad guys. But in this case, back in 1897, when this gentleman murdered somebody at Buffalo Creek, he got away with it and confessed it on his deathbed. I suppose hoping that by doing so he would get his place in heaven. Who knows? But at any rate, interesting story, tragic ending, but interesting story. I had actually there's another story that I had written just recently too. This one would take place in the early 1900s, and it was interesting. There was this pack of wild rabid dogs running around Glencoe, and I think we would look at that today and be like, well, how can that happen? But at this time, it's things were maybe a little bit looser, and people's dogs just kind of roamed. Maybe they weren't tied up and penned up as much as they are now, or lived inside with their owners like they do now. But at any rate, in the spring of don't even ask me the year right now, but early 1900s in Glencoe, and all of a sudden these two little girls are out playing, and they get attacked by these dogs. Luckily, they didn't get bit into flesh, because that spreads rabies. But they get attacked by these dogs. And a little while later on the same day, another woman gets attacked by a dog. And this one actually rips her whole skirt off. And there again, she was lucky enough that the dog didn't actually bite into any flesh. But all of a sudden, you have these reports of dog attacks in town and sightings in town. And it turns out that there's a rabies outbreak in Glencoe at this time. And how the dogs got it. You have to remember that we're going back to a time where like I had said earlier, the landscape is still kind of wild compared to what it would be today. Everybody still had a back 40 out in the country that had been untouched, that hadn't been turned over by a plow yet. You still had a little bit of prairie land. You still had wild groves of trees that hadn't been cleared away, and so just the land was a lot wilder. And that being the case, you had a lot more wild animals living there than we would today. And so I suppose, rabies usually comes through like skunks, raccoons, bats, those sort of animals. And so there was probably a dog that got into a fight with, a rabid animal, got bit, got infected, came into Hutchinson, or excuse me, not Hutchinson, came into Glencoe. People are going to love that. Came into Glencoe and bit a domestic dog, and it just snowballed. And all of a sudden, you have this pack of rabid dogs running around Glencoe. And I believe there was 26 of them was the count, full count at one time. And so they actually put a notice out that any dog that wasn't chained up or penned up or inside was going to be shot. The town sheriff was sent the notice out. He's going to go around, and they are actually going to purge all the dogs they saw in town, and they did so. They shot all 26 dogs. I don't know if there was any innocent dogs that were killed or not, but at any rate, there again, it's like, man, these are like Wild West kind of stories, but they happened in the 20th century. But at any rate, those are our stories for the week. I've got a couple of events coming up for June that I'd like to share with you. On June 2nd at 5:30 p.m., we have a Hutchinson native, Jeff Milton, coming into the museum, and he is a metal detector hobbyist, and he's going to be sharing some of his finds as well as talking a little bit about the hobby. We're calling it Digging Up History, because essentially that's what they're doing. These guys and gals who do metal detecting find all kinds of interesting stuff, and usually it has something to do with the local history of the location that they're found. So anyway, he's going to come down to the museum on Thursday, June 2nd at 5:30 p.m. Then following up the next week on June 6th at 10:30 a.m., we are going to have a little roundtable discussion at the museum about D-Day. Since June 6th is D-Day, it just seemed appropriate that we would talk about it on that day. Well, we have these little roundtable discussions about every other month at the museum, and it's kind of fun. We get some history enthusiasts around, and we start drinking some coffee, eating some rolls, and the stories fly, and you always learn something, and it's a good time. If you like history, I highly recommend coming down for it. It's free admission. Both of these events is free admission, so definitely come down and take advantage of that. Then lastly, on June 16th, we are going to have our second writers group, which we've named History Writers. This will always happen on the third Thursday of every month at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our first one was held back in May, and it was fun. We had, maybe about 7 or 8 writers come to the museum, and we just kind of shared our writing styles. We had some people there who did like family history, writing that down for kids, future grandkids and stuff to be able to look back and read. We had myself there, of course. I write a column in the Hutch Leader and in the McLeod County Chronicle. We had a gentleman from Penn Township who writes a little article about Penn Township. We had somebody from Glencoe who's actually doing a history book on Glencoe. And it was just very interesting. We all sat around, like I said, we shared ideas and kind of talked about different viewpoints, how we write and everything. And there was no assignment or anything like that. We all just said we were gonna go home and we were gonna write something or just bring what we have been working on at the next meeting and kind of discuss it. I don't know if we'll critique it, but just kind of discuss what we've been doing, what we've been working on. And even if you're not a writer, we had a couple of people who aren't writers show up to this event, and they just wanted to listen, because we talked about history and we talked about how we write about history. And so if you're there again, if you're a history enthusiast, it's just interesting to come and sit down. But at any rate, we'll be having those every third Thursday of the month at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So definitely come and check that out as well. That is about all we have for you this month. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again next month with some more stories and some more what's going on at the museum. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.